Attention, school-based dyslexia educators.
Are you tired of juggling prep work and paper materials?
Amplio Reading Intervention is here to give you more time for what matters most, your students.
Amplio offers fully digitized versions of the renowned MTA and Esperanza curricula, making it easier than ever to deliver structured literacy intervention and track progress in real time, all while staying aligned with Texas Dyslexia Handbook standards.
Come join countless districts who are simplifying their dyslexia interventions with Amplio.
Learn more at ampliolearning.com. That's AMPLIO learning.com. Because empowering students starts with empowering educators.
Hi, this is Amy
And Melissa. We are a couple of retired Texas teachers who are CALTs, Certified Academic Language Therapists. We started our own businesses, and now we have a podcast called
The Dyslexia Duo. So join us for our informative podcast, where we'll delve into dyslexia, covering the topics that affect parents, therapists, teachers, practitioners, and anyone who wants to learn more. We'll guide you through everything you need to know, from the first signs to the intricacies of dyslexia curriculum placement and beyond.
This season, we will cover the referral process, what to expect when your child or student is dyslexic, the generational impacts of dyslexia, and how to support those affected.
Come join us.
Hey, Amy.
Hey, Melissa.
Today, we had Joan Sedita on the podcast. Wasn't that fun?
It was actually really fun. It was a lot of fun.
We learned so much from her and her decades of instruction and research. We definitely have to have her back.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that. So I'm going to tell y'all a little bit about Joan Sedita. She is the creator, the author of the Writing Rope framework, and the lead author of the Keys to Literacy professional development materials, online courses, books, which include the Key Comprehension Routine, the Key Vocabulary Routine, Keys to Content Writing, Keys to Early Writing, and Keys to Beginning Reading. And she's authored more than that, including the Landmark Study Guide, Study Skills, a Teaching Guide, Active Learning and Study Strategies using Kurzweil 3000, and Writing the Road to Reading Comprehension Module 11 of the Letters Reading Training Series. And she's authored several book chapters, including one that all of us CALTs and practitioners know, The Multisensory Teaching of Basic Language Skills, 3rd edition. And she was the chapter Learning to Write and Writing to Learn in the Fundamentals of Literacy Instruction and Assessment. And her book, The Writing Rope, A Framework for Explicit Writing Instruction, was published fairly recently.
I really liked how she explained the strands of the writing rope and how the individual strands need to blend together for a successful writing experience.
Absolutely.
So now let's weave our way into the episode.
Can y'all tell Melissa was listening to the interview because we talked about using more precise vocabulary. So good job, Melissa.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Melissa.
And Amy, and we're the
Dyslexia Duo.
So today we have the author of The Writing Rope, Joan Sedita, with us, and we're so excited that she's here, and we've just been looking forward to this interview for quite some time. So I know our audience knows who you are, but go ahead and tell our listening audience, and we have a pretty broad one. It's not just teachers or dyslexia type or literacy type, but even parents and decision makers listen to the podcast, and it's global. So
we are global.
So go ahead and tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Well, I got started in the field of literacy education a long time ago in the mid-70s. And my very first job out of college was teaching at a school for students with dyslexia called the Landmark School. It's still a very well-known school. And I actually was there for 23 years. I started as a tutor and a teacher. The school was growing at the time. And I, within a couple of years, became a supervisor of tutorials. And over my time there, I developed a lot of the curriculum that was used for writing, teaching writing, reading. And you have to understand back then, not very many people understood dyslexia, right? We also had students across all ages from all over the country because they lived there. They were there. It was a residential school. And early on, I started teaching the older students. Now, some of them were older, but still could barely read. And, you had to do your basic foundational skills with them. But many of them had the decoding and the fluency wasn't that bad. The issues were more the higher level comprehension, writing, right? The things around structured language that you need to be a proficient reader and writer. So that's where I sort of cut my teeth. I also was eventually principal of the high school, but I started a program there after I got out of Harvard, where I got my master's. I began to realize, this was in the late 70s, that the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Acts had been passed, which finally said that all disabilities, but including dyslexia, specific learning disability, our students could no longer be discriminated against. And that meant when they went to college, they could actually share that they had that disability and get services. So I worked on a thesis paper around that, trying to unpack Section 504 as it relates to dyslexics. That ended up having me work with a lot of colleges on how to set up learning centers. But I also ended up starting at Landmark School something called the Landmark College Prep School, which was for students that had graduated high school, wanted to go to college, but didn't have the skills. I ran that program for 3 years. It was very successful. And then it just got so large that Landmark purchased an old college campus in Vermont, which we turned into the Landmark College. I did not move to Vermont to run that program, but that has since gone on and been very, very successful. So that was my time at Landmark. And it was fascinating because it wasn't until I started going out into the public sector and working in public schools and consulting that I realized much of what we learned to do working in a place like that understood structured language and the need to be explicit, right? That many teachers across the country didn't understand that at all. Mm-hmm. So when I left there in 1998, I did several things. I was the lead trainer in Massachusetts for the Reading First program. So along with 2 colleagues, we trained 70 trainers that went on to train 5,000 amazing. I consulted with the Massachusetts Department of Ed. I also connected early on back in 2004 with my friend and colleague, Louisa Moats. We had been at graduate school together, and Louisa was just creating something called the Letters modules.
Oh, wow.
Meetings. And so I co-authored one of those modules. It was called Writing the Road to Reading Comprehension. Anyway, I did consulting with a lot of districts for quite a while and then basically had too much work. So in 2007, I founded Keys to Literacy, which is the company that I'm still the CEO of and the founder. And through Keys to Literacy, oh my goodness, we've done so many things. We work with hundreds of schools across the country, training teachers on the best way to teach reading and writing to all students. But I will say I continue to lean on what I learned from that time working with these struggling students. The good pedagogy for kids that struggle works with all kids. That's exactly my history.
In a nutshell, right? That's awesome. That's great. Thank you.
I guess I just wanted to kind of make sure I understand. As far as your letters, that letters component, you were like a co-author in one of those components of the letters?
Yes. Yeah, and letters was used in those early years for a variety of purposes. It's since moved online. That original module 11, they don't publish that anymore. But it was based on, actually, what I integrated into that was based on one of the first books I ever authored, which was for Landmark School. It was called the Landmark Study Skills Guide. It's 35 years old. And what I did there and also wove into Module 11 eventually became the core of what is now, we call it the Key Comprehension Routine, which is one of the training courses from Keys to Literacy. My original book on that was written 2006. And then I followed that with the key vocabulary routine. How do you teach vocabulary? Then how do you teach content writing? How do you teach writing in kindergarten to first graders? I think one of the questions you had for me was what books have I written? I don't know. There are 9 or 10 of them. But the first one was that study skills guide. And back then, study skills really was a combination of comprehension strategies, note taking, summarizing, right? But it also was things that kids need, especially those students who have executive function issues, right? That organizing and planning difficulties, which, a lot of students with dyslexia also have ADHD. And so in there, I had developed this thing called a master notebook system to help kids organizing their materials. That was a whole wonderful thing. I worked with a lot of schools on that. Yeah, so another thing that happened, and I think it started because my teaching work was with some older students, is that I've sort of become somewhat of an expert on adolescent literacy. And so back in 2011, I think. So some of your reader or listeners may know of Judith Birch's book. It's called Multisensory Teaching. I think it's in its 4th edition. For the 3rd edition, I wrote the chapter about adolescent literacy, which is always been a passion of mine. And right now I'm in the middle of developing a 30 to 40 hour training course about adolescent literacy and a book that I'm writing for Brooks Publishing. So that's what I'm focusing now, is that secondary, because we forget about those kids, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think I would love information on that, because I have middle school kids who have finished with a dyslexia curriculum, and we're working on literacy skills and writing and all that. I'm not as well versed in those as everything else.
Yeah, you're not alone. I mean, a lot of folks don't really understand what you do after elementary. And unfortunately, the vast numbers of students that are moving into middle and high school that don't have grade level reading and writing skills, and even the ones that leave grade 4 who maybe have grade level skills, that's no guarantee that they're going to stay at grade.
Right.
And it's a lot harder also. I was just writing about this yesterday, because, elementary teachers, especially in the earliest grades, they know that part of their mission is reading and writing. Like that's, we want kids to learn science and write social studies. But once students move to middle school, there's no time in the day. English teachers are often focused on teaching literature, right? And many content teachers just have not been trained on how to integrate into their subject areas. So we've got a big problem in this country with the kids that are graduating without being able to read and write. So yeah, that's a little bit of my history and some of the books that I've written. The exciting one right now is the Writing Rope one, which Brooks published 2 years ago. And it's going gangbusters. I keep hearing of all these places doing book studies. And so at this point in my career, it's really nice to know that, putting all that into this book about writing is being used by folks. Like, what else could you ask for?
Right. And, I guess what my question is, we do have listeners that have asked specifically for information on high school, getting into adulthood literacy, and wanting information on how to help them. So I'm really excited about what you're saying that you have to share. Is the Writing Rope a portion of that we could share with our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, what we're going to be talking about on the podcast today, we're going to be talking about several things around comprehension, reading comprehension, but writing, and a lot of it is connected to reading and writing beyond grade 4, right? The other thing that I'd say, if it's okay to share my website. So at Keys to Literacy, and my colleagues there, we put together a really large collection of free resources. Articles, including a copy of that chapter of the book I mentioned, right? Articles, all kinds of recorded webinars that I've done, not only for Keys to Literacy, but also for IDA, for Patan out of Pennsylvania. And they're all there. People can watch them for free. I also have a really large collection of printables and templates and downloadables. And there's an awful lot in there around adolescent literacy. So yeah, just go to the Keys to Literacy website. Up on the top, you'll see free resources. Great way to access.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the explicitness needed for reading and writing. why should teachers, even if parents are working with their students at home, what's the importance behind explicitness when writing? Should teachers teach reading strategies and writing strategies?
Yeah, and also listening and speaking. Let's not forget that,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
The IDA coined a term, structured literacy, a few years back, right? And part of structured literacy is an explicit approach to teaching things. It also includes scaffolds. It also is associated with, well, Pearson and Gallagher termed it gradual release of responsibility, but a lot of folks know it as I do it, we do it, you do it, right? I mean, these things are all connected. And I think the whole concept of explicit instruction, you could apply it to anything. So I want you to think about, some kids who want to play soccer, let's say, right? It comes naturally to them, right? They watch some soccer, like they're just amazing. Or some people, they just have an ear for music and like they hear and they can play it. But most, right, need to be taught and they need guided practice. And just like a coach for soccer would take specific skills, maybe dribbling down the field, right? Passing, and you give specific instruction, modeling it, using think aloud. Then you give lots of guided practice so that as the students are trying these things, you're giving them adjustments till eventually you want them to do the skills separate on their own. But you also have to give them guided support for putting all those skills together and playing a game. And that's another thing, right? So that little metaphor, I think you can certainly apply to anything that we want to teach kids. I remember when I was getting my degree, I was very lucky to have Dr. Jean Shaw as my advisor. She's, oh my gosh, she was just a force in our field. Yeah. But on the very first day of the very first reading class, she said, okay, you think you're all going to be reading specialists. And I'm going to tell you right now that 40% of the kids you teach to read are going to relearn to read no matter what you do. It's the other 60%. And, that's so very true, right? So while it is true that there are some kids who can learn to read without a whole lot of explicit instruction, many kids need it. And it certainly doesn't hurt the students who are able to pick it up on their own. And I often see a lot of this with the issue of spelling, because, you can see a lot of students now in their 20s and 30s who went through our education system at a time that was the height of a whole language approach, which did not explicitly teach. And you can see, two of my sons are like that, right? They can read, but if you ask them to spell, they can't. And that's because the English orthography system is rather complex. And the instruction that kids get around explicit phonics instruction is not just to read. It ends up helping their spelling as well. Yep. It's the hallmark of just high quality education. And there isn't anything that I try to suggest to a teacher to teach that explicitness doesn't pay off.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, this is Melissa with Kids First Dyslexia Services. I am excited to share with you my private practice. Kids First Dyslexia Services is a private practice that specializes in dyslexia therapy. Each one-on-one session focuses on instruction specific to your child's needs in a nurturing environment that develops self-esteem, builds confidence, and fosters a sense of accomplishment, resulting in happier kids with higher levels of achievement. We provide a professional, personalized experience, always putting the child first. We value the relationships with both our students and parents because strengthening skills and overcoming hurdles to achieve desired goals and success is a team effort. For more information, please visit www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com. That is www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com.
Hi there. This is Amy Rodenroth, owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services. So tell me if any of these situations are familiar to you. Your dyslexia teacher / therapist has suddenly retired unexpectedly, and you do not have the personnel to fill the space. Or You do not have enough trained teachers or therapists for the number of students who have qualified for dyslexia services, and you need a trained teacher or therapist quickly, like yesterday, quickly. Or you need a teacher to provide compensatory services, and you do not have anyone that can provide what's needed. Well, what do? I'm going to tell you what you can do. You can call Discovery Dyslexia Services. Discovery Dyslexia Services can help you with your various dyslexia concerns. We have multiple COUTs who can provide virtual small group therapy. We can also train your teachers in most dyslexia curricula, either virtually or on site. Just let us know how we can help support you. For more information, go to our website at www.discovereed.com. Let me spell that for you. DYSCOVEREAD.com. I don't know, it's a funny name, but we're providing huge services for our dyslexic population. So keep in mind, Discovery Dyslexia Services, covering all your dyslexia needs. If you have a business related to literacy and or supporting those with dyslexia, like and share our Facebook page to get a shout out like these.
Lori Emerson Kennemer with Crowley ISD. She's going to share our flyer with her team and parents.
Oh, amazing. Nikki Richardson, COUT TN Dyslexia Alliance.
Nikki Winter, Brilliant Strengths author.
MMS Dyslexia Awareness. Thank you to all the wonderful individuals who have liked and shared our page with their family and friends.
Please continue to like, share, and review on whatever listening platform you use and on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you.
Bye. Let's return to the show.
Well, and I think about that leading into comprehension. And comprehension is one of those things that I feel for me as a teacher who in the regular classroom before I became a dyslexia therapist, I felt like comprehension was one of the hardest things to teach. And I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't explicitly taught how to teach comprehension, but I was wondering if you could shed some light to me and others who are in the same shoes. How would you instruct teachers to use comprehension strategies, not just using a worksheet, but how would you instruct somebody?
First of all, yes, comprehension is very hard. And I don't want to say that the foundational skills aren't hard either, but there's a sort of science to them. And once you learn the orthographic system, right, it's all right. Comprehension is hard because it's got so many facets to it. So when I write about comprehension, I say, there's actually 4 components to instruction. One is vocabulary, and people keep it separate, but vocabulary is so tied to comprehension. If you're reading something and you're not familiar with at least 90 to 95% of the words, it's going to trip your comprehension up. So that's one way. The second one is your background knowledge. And that's needed because what's sometimes referred to as the mental model or the situational model of comprehension, which says that in order to really make meaning, there's what the text brings. And the text on the surface, maybe it's very specific and gives you direct information, but there's also a sub to the text, the things that are inferred, right? But it's equal parts what the reader brings. What do they bring in terms of their skills to be able to read the words, right? To have enough vocabulary to understand syntax, but also what does the reader bring in terms of the background knowledge they know, which is needed to make the inferences, right? And the more you know about a subject, the easier it is to understand it. So that's why I say after vocabulary, a second important component is background knowledge. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, okay? The third thing is text structure. And we forget about text structure. Yeah. And by the way, anything you do to teach text structure also helps kids write. But when you're reading, there are all kinds of clues we get from the structure. What do you learn from an introduction or a conclusion or those little transition words, therefore, however, right? What's the structure of a paragraph? And if our kids don't get that, when they're reading, they miss a very important clue. right? When there's an indent or you skip to a next paragraph, that's like a signpost saying we're going to switch main ideas. Kids don't get that. So text structure, we want to teach that. The fourth one, and the one that most folks are familiar with, is comprehension strategies. What are those strategies? And the reading panel, God, National Reading Panel identified them more than 20 years ago, a few of them, and research just keeps backing that up. Summarizing is a big one, right? Also turns out that summarizing also supports writing, right? Using graphic organizers, right? Having kids make predictions. Any task that's going to have kids be metacognitive and really think critically. To me, 2-column notes falls under that, right? Stopping as you're reading and writing down what was the gist, the big idea, what was the important details. So that's what comprehension strategies are. You can't focus on just one of those four things, right? So, and that's where I want to come back to background knowledge, because while it is true that if you know something about what you're reading, you're going to be able to connect to it better. No doubt about it. And part of that is because that also means you know the words, the vocabulary associated with that topic, you have a schema about that topic. So absolutely true. But what if kids come to the table about something they're going to read and they don't have background knowledge? Well, that's where we have to preview the vocabulary, right? We've got to fill in some background knowledge because maybe they don't have prior knowledge, right? One of the things that's been interesting to me in the last couple of years, there's been a re-emphasis on the role of background knowledge, and that's good. We don't want to forget it. But I think there are some in our field that have reached the conclusion that background knowledge is the solution to all of it. That, if we simply begin in the earliest grades, making sure we teach enough science and history and right and expose kids, and we can do that through thematic units, right? And sets of texts around the same topics. I mean, all that is really good, but that forgets the other three things. That alone is not going to do it. So there's actually a blog post I wrote last year in support of comprehension strategies and main idea work, right? Because I just think it's important. We have decades of research showing that explicit instruction of strategies is important. So the only thing I'd add to that is the explicitness, but also the best way to teach these strategies. And I think it was something that you were saying, Melissa, is not through these isolated worksheets. It's got to be integrated and taught and practiced using the text that students are already reading, right? That's what makes it meaningful. And that's also why it has to happen outside of just the ELA class.
Yeah.
All teachers have to do that.
That makes sense. And I guess I have one more thing to add to that comprehension discussion that you were having. I feel like sometimes there are kids that are they just have comprehension strategies built in. They're like innate. I feel like that was a strength of mine. I was able to just sit down, read a book, and understand what it meant. Is that because of the background knowledge of vocabulary that was already innate in me or in other kids? Is that part of it? Or do you have an explanation for that?
Well, like I said, it certainly helps if you have the background knowledge, right? But I'm sure, Melissa, that in your lifetimes, maybe when you were in college, right, there were things you read that you didn't have background knowledge. That's why you were going to school, right? So that's not the only thing figuring in. As I was saying before, I think some things do come naturally to folks, right? And some of this is linked to executive functions, right? Planning, goal setting, cognitive flexibility, right? So some students figure this out. I think about back on my elementary up till grade 12, and no one ever taught me to take notes. No one ever taught me to summarize, right? But I also remember that my first year or so of college was hard because nobody did.
Yeah.
But it's many of our students, and these are the ones that go to college and don't succeed. And that's a lot of what we were doing in that college prep program that I mentioned before that I started, that we ran, was in the 1980s. There were a lot of students who had the basic skills. They were smart cookies, they could do well, on their SATs. They were getting into colleges and they would flunk out because they didn't know how to study. They didn't know how to do those things. So you're lucky, Melissa. That's, yeah, right.
I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I definitely have issues. I would just was saying, I wonder, I think about my students that I have, and I can see some of them just have that ability. And it just made me wonder, how that plays a part.
I think it's kind of interesting because we were talking about using content across the curriculum, like maybe using textbooks or books that they have, maybe if there's science and there's social study, to help build some of that background knowledge for other pieces, right? So doing some cross-subject reading and maybe even researching with that could support that.
Well, integrating not only reading, but integrating writing to content teaching is also important, right? Well, so here's something else for folks to think about. A lot of, right now I'm in the middle of developing an adolescent literacy training course. And, as I'm reading up on the more recent research, what's really fascinating is that middle and then especially in high school, many teachers avoid even assigning reading and writing to students because they feel that, look, I've got to get through a certain amount of curriculum in my science class or my math class, right? And my kids have trouble reading the grade level material, so I'm just not going to assign it, right? I'm going to teach them the content through PowerPoints and videos, and right? And that's great. Maybe you get the content across. But what they're not doing is giving the kids a chance to learn and practice at higher and higher levels how to apply those close reading, critical reading, how to apply strategies. So it's kind of between a rock and a hard place. It's important that all students have access to high quality text that's content related. Mm-hmm. But what that means is teachers have got to find the time and need to be prepared to, when they're going to use that text, not just here, read it, right? But do that explicit instruction. Let's take 3 paragraphs out of this, the Gettysburg Address, right? Or from this science book, this about experiments. And let's closely read it together. I'm going to model for you. What do you do when you come to a really long sentence that, what strategies might you use if you come to a long word and you don't know what it means? Let's practice writing a summary. And also embedded in what we're talking about here also is the difference between what's called content literacy, skills and strategies, and disciplinary literacy, which is a newer focus. It's only been since around 2008 when Doctors Timothy and Cynthia Shanahan wrote like kind of their first seminal piece about disciplinary literacy. And a lot of people talk about it like, oh, it's important, our high schoolers need to learn this. But a lot of folks don't really know what it means.
Right.
And how is it different from content literacy? I mean, a real quick primer. So content literacy are those strategies and skills, and they're more generic, right? They could be applied in any subject. So how do you summarize? How might you take notes, right? How could you paraphrase something? What generic strategies can you use when you're reading and you find a word? How to use the context and the meaningful part, right? Like, so they're generic things that could be applied anywhere. Disciplinary is, what are the very specific, unique things about reading and writing in science versus math versus doing a literary analysis? Like, it's often described as, how does a mathematician or a historian or a scientist read and write? And what are the things you need to know? To me, because I've spent so much of my career working with kids who struggle, I think, yes, we need kids to understand how is text in a math, when you read about math, different than literature, right? But many of our kids who don't have those content level skills, right? And worse, those who still can't decode the words on the page or aren't fluent. We can't forget that even though kids are moving into our upper grades, we've got to fill in those holes, those Swiss cheese holes, right? And not jump right to this really high level. Because again, if they can't read the words on the page, it's going to be pretty hard to do that higher level disciplinary work.
So we have to develop, well, obviously they have to be able to read it and write it. We have to develop the content area first before we jump into the very specific disciplinary areas.
I I would say for the most part, yes, meaning make sure those things are solid, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean that you can't start letting kids see what's unique about math writing,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you can even do that in the earliest grades. If you take a math book, look any math book, even in fifth grade, right? Math is words, but mostly symbols. In fact, Greek symbols and formulas. That is really different. So
Mm-hmm.
it, a teacher, even in fourth grade, can start pointing that out to student. What's different about our math book from our social studies book?
Right.
But not focusing just on that because they still have to learn how to read any kind of book
Right.
and write about any kind of book.
Okay. All right. All right. That helps me.
Good.
That's awesome. So then, taking that one step further, how do we support the vocabulary for the background knowledge for these content levels
Yeah.
of instruction?
And I would also say vocabulary because kids need words to write. And a lot of students, when they write, they can't write or they get really frustrated because they have great ideas. They want to communicate, but they can't find the words, right? Vocabulary is one of those neglected areas. I think I see teachers getting better at it, but for a long time, it was kind of left up to a vocabulary notebook, the 10 words we're going to learn every week, right? Or left up to, how textbooks oftentimes kind of bold some words and say, these are the words you have to teach. Well, maybe those are the words that those kids don't need, right? Maybe they need something else. But I do see teachers realizing that vocabulary is more than that instruction. But this is another one of those things that's got multiple components. The literature and the research about vocabulary, I mean, I've developed a whole programs about it. My vocabulary routine is about combining things, right? So teachers need a combination of what they call direct instructional practices and indirect. Direct is things like, I'm going to specifically teach you these words, or I'm going to teach you a strategy for using the context to figure out what a word means, okay? Or I'm going to preview these 15 words and give you a little information so you won't stumble over them when you're reading, right? But indirect are things like wide reading, making sure kids are reading a lot and they're reading a lot of different things, because the main way that we learn words is through exposure to them in print or listening, right? So direct, indirect. Teachers want to be hitting both breadth of knowledge. So you want to have kids learn a little bit about a lot of words, but also a few words that are really key. You want them to learn deeply. And some of your listeners might be familiar with Isabel Beck and her colleagues' work. They developed that sort of 3-tier model as a way to help teachers identify what words are worth teaching in depth. So we've got to teach how to preview because it's so important. We also need to foster word consciousness in the classroom, having kids have fun with words, make them see that as teachers, we're always learning new words. So there's so much about vocabulary. But I think one of the oldest findings in the research is that how closely related vocabulary and comprehension are. And you really aren't going to improve comprehension until we start growing our kids' vocabulary.
Okay, so let's and I do morphology studies with my students, so in fact, I was doing that with my older student that I had here the other day. And we were taking, affixes and roots and combining forms and trying to do it that way. And he was making words that weren't real words, but he was able to tell me why he was making that into a word. And I thought, I kind of love it. It's not a word, but I see where you're going with that, because he was giving me the meaning for the different parts. And I thought that was a really valuable activity for him to do for understanding and drawing in vocabulary. And I was a victim of the 10 words a week for vocabulary test.
Listen, I was originally also, morphology is so important, especially as kids get older, both for supporting vocabulary, right? But also for advanced decoding of multisyllabic words, grades 4 or 5. And a lot of our kiddos, they come to a long word and they don't know how to attack it. So that's really important. There's a word for when you take word parts and create words that are not real, but they have meaning.
Oh.
They're called making a neologism.
Okay, I got to write it down.
Neologism. And that's an example of the kind of thing you can do that like kids love to build sort of word consciousness and an excitement about words. So like your students did, they come up with a word and they have to tell you what it means based on the meaningful part. You can even have them draw little pictures about what that word might, if it's a noun, what it might look like. Yeah, and that's a way to get kids excited about that.
It was fun. It was fun for both of us. So I want to jump into just kind of reading areas. And I want to talk a little bit about inference because we said that summary was really hard. I think for especially my dyslexic students, that inference piece, because I can teach them a strategy how to summarize, but inference, it's so hard. And conversely, I have a child on the autism spectrum, and he's very face value. What's there is black and white. He can fact gather. He struggles with inference. So what can we do? How does inference help in reading?
Yeah, so inference is needed to what some people refer to read between the lines. So and this is why that situation model is based on what the text brings and what the reader brings. If the text, everything is there on the surface level, it's telling you exactly what you need to know, that's going to be much easier than it gives you some information, but it's not exactly stating, and you've got to figure out what it is, right? I forget who did this example, and I won't get it exactly right, but it goes something like this, Mary and Johnny were on the beach. They had their shovels and their pails, and then the wave came and they started crying. That's not exactly, but like, so what do you think happened? They were probably building a sandcastle, right?
Yeah.
And then what happened? The wave took it away. Sad, but it doesn't ever come right out and say that. So think about what the background knowledge you need to bring. First of all, you need to know that you use shovels and pails to probably build a sandcastle, right? You need to know about how waves work and how and so that's a very simple example, but that's why you bring your background knowledge. Now, think about a young child who's never been on a beach, who's never seen waves. Very hard to make that inference because they don't have what's needed. So here's another place that inference comes into play, and it has to do with main idea work. I mentioned before that paragraph, to understand the concept of a paragraph, what is it? It's built around a main idea. And, you might be writing or reading about a topic. Maybe it's about pirates, right? And maybe at first you want to talk about pirates in the Caribbean. So your paragraph's going to be about that. And then maybe the next paragraph is going to be about buccaneer pirates, right? So the purpose of moving to a new paragraph is that we have a different main idea about that topic. Now, if you're lucky when you're reading, the person who wrote it will give you that main idea in a topic sentence. So start off something like, in the 1700s, buccaneer pirates were all over, right? Now it's about buccaneer pirates. But if it doesn't, if all you're doing is reading a whole bunch of details and you don't know you've got to use your inferencing skills to put all those together to say, what's the main idea? Okay. That's why we have to explicitly teach main idea skills, not in worksheets, right?
Right.
But really in those situations. If I give you some words, if I say apple, pear, fruit, peach, banana, was there one word in there that was the main topic? And the answer is fruit. But if all I say is apple, pear, peach, banana, you got to look at all those details and say, what do they have in common? And that means you've got to make a little bit of an inference. They're fruit. I've actually had kids reply and say pies.
Oh.
And you go, what? Well, that's where background knowledge comes in. This child, her father was a baker and he made pies all the time. So when she saw peach and she thought of banana cream pies, peach pies, apple pies, and you know what? That's correct. That is something they have in common. Now, what you can't do is you can build kids' background knowledge. You can, before they read something, if you know it's going to require inference making based on background knowledge. You can backfill that knowledge ahead of time, right? By providing prior knowledge so that they can make it. But the other thing is some students just don't know how to go about making an inference. And so you can start with very simple things. You could use like that example about the beach and say, and the student comes up and say, what did you do to make that happen? You can give them sentence stems. I see this in the picture. I also see this in the picture. That tells me that. And then you fill in the blank. So it can get right down to kids not having the language to make an inference either.
Those are very good
That's
strategies.
great.
Thank you for that.
This concludes part 1 of our interview with Joan Sedita. Join us next week as we resume our discussion with her. The Dyslexia Duo podcast hosts are Amy Redenroth.
Melissa Dean.
Our producer is Greg Rodenroth.
You can find us on Facebook at The Dyslexia Duo.
Email us any questions or comments at thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com.
Awareness is so important. Share this podcast with your friends,
Family,
and teachers.
thanks for joining us.
Bye.